I'm Nicole Gauthier, Extension Plant Pathologist for commercial vegetable and home vegetable production, as a matter of fact. And as Dr. Rudolph said, we've been working on this trial. We started in the spring. This is our first lettuce planting. You see, these are larger. So we did this one 6 weeks ago.
Yeah.
About 6 weeks ago. The one right behind me, we did about 4 weeks ago. And the one we did this week is here. So you'll see the different ages and sizes. And as Dr. Rudolph said, we're trying to look at planting date to determine what if we can if we can avoid the active period of the Sclerotinia fungus. So Sclerotinia sclerotiorum is very common in not just Kentucky, but across much of the US. It's a soil-borne pathogen. It'll spend its entire life in the soil. If it does come out of the soil, it'll affect crowns and any plant tissue that's right at the ground level. So we call it a soil-borne pathogen. So this Sclerotinia, when it's infecting lettuce, we call the disease lettuce drop. But when it's on tomato, we call it timber rot, or when it's on beans, we call it white mold. So it can infect different types of plants, not just vegetables. And every time it changes host, we typically change the disease name, not our choice. It's just the way it is, right? We don't make these decisions. But the Sclerotinia fungi prefer cooler temperatures. So that's why it's so severe on lettuce, or for instance, on very early tomato. 65 degrees Fahrenheit, it's its optimal temperature. And so that's why we're looking at planting date. Can we plant earlier in the spring when the temperatures are colder than 65 degrees? Or can we plant before soil temperatures lower? So we're trying to avoid that 65 to 75 degree soil temperature window. And so as Dr. Rudolph said, we have not seen Sclerotinia yet in this tunnel. So maybe this is a good indicator that our early lettuce might avoid infection simply because of that temperature window. In the springtime, we avoided it in our earliest planting, and we avoided it a little bit in our latest planting. So we're trying to identify those windows as it pertains to Kentucky temperatures.
Yeah, the mid planting date, which is probably when most people are doing lettuce.
That's right.
Was actually the worst.
But we had good yields on our earlier planting.
Right.
So it didn't affect yield,
right.
Not enough to when we factored in the amount of disease. So and we're going to see what happens here. Here in Kentucky, we have a shorter fall, so we may have a narrower window in that optimal temperature range in the fall, whereas in the spring it was a little bit wider. So we're exploring that a little bit. Also, as Dr. Rudolph said, we're looking at two different water regimes, two different irrigation regimes. So Sclerotinia like that 60 to 80% field capacity, or field capacity. Yes. I'm sorry. Yes. 60 to 80% field capacity. So our dry side, our low irrigation side is below that. So we were aiming to 40 or 50%, whereas our high side, which is where we are, we're aiming for that 60 to 80% where Sclerotinia would be happy. So we're trying to induce it here, and then we're trying to determine whether that drier side, even when temperatures are optimal, if that amount of irrigation is going to affect the activity of this pathogen. Remember too, we talk about rotations within those considerations. Spring tomatoes, especially coming in that April-May window, can definitely be infected. So what is our rotation going to look like? Where do we see resistance, not just with lettuce, but also with tomato? So we're looking at a lot of different aspects of Sclerotinia and how we can help growers manage their crop, have a profitable crop, even if they're not going to use fungicides and soil amendments or soil fumigation. And Dr. Rudolph did mention, so some of these cultivars, we have 0 now, but in the springtime, this pea rat was extremely susceptible. It was the first of the cultivars to become infected. We had very low yields as a result of infection, whereas Harmony, this pretty green one, Harmony is listed as susceptible, and it was probably one of our best cultivars.
It's a great one, yeah.
Yeah, so we're looking at, again, the amount of disease, and Dr. Rudolph's group is looking at yield. And then we're going to, of course, put numbers and dollars to that to help growers determine at each season, spring and fall, whether lettuce and what cultural practices help them avoid Sclerotinia disease, even if there is inoculum in the soil.
And for those of you curious, these are all butterhead or butterhead romaine cross types. So they're a one harvest lettuce head that's makes it easier for us to, you know, evaluate them for yield and for pathology to evaluate them for lettuce drop. If they start to go down, they can just remove it and take it to the lab. So it's a single harvest lettuce heads. So a question that I think something that would be surprising for people is the soil depth where Sclerotinia can be the most devastating. What about that?
Okay, so Sclerotinia will start to decay once it's buried below 2 inches of the soil. So but just tilling it in, and I know a lot of people like no-till practices in the field in particular, but if you bury the sclerotia are the survival structures produced by the Sclerotinia fungus. So by burying it, there'll be a faster decomposition. So it's the sclerotia that are kind of on the surface or in that upper 2 inches of soil that are going to be the ones to germinate and to infect. So tillage is another cultural practice, and we talk about that in our fact sheet. So we have a new fact sheet on Sclerotinia diseases, and we will put that link in the chat box. And for those watching on the video, we will add those links to the description. But Sclerotinia does like it to be on the surface. So sanitation is another consideration. So once you start seeing diseased plants, to remove those plants altogether so that the new sclerotia don't drop onto the surface of the soil and increase that amount of inoculum in the soil. But even after harvest, to be sure to get out all debris, because that is where those sclerotia attach and hang out. And so that's another consideration. So sanitation, and I know our entomologists will talk about sanitation in different ways today. I'll talk about sanitation also as well as we go. Sanitation means clean it up, just like we clean our houses and we clean all of our personal surfaces. Our agricultural and horticultural areas also need to be cleaned during the season and between seasons.
So the diseased plants, if you were to come in here in the spring, you would see a random plant here and there just wilted, right? There would be no real explanation for it wilting, right? That would be your first indication that it was lettuce drop. Literally, the lettuce has dropped, right? The leaves are just sagging and it looks as if it is not getting enough water. But all the plants around it look fine, right? And so that would be your first indication. Then you flip it over. This is the one disease I can spot from a mile away because I have it all over the place here, you turn it over, right? And you're gonna see probably some white fuzzy material, the mycelium, and then maybe some peppercorn looking things that look a little bit like insect frass, but they're bigger.
More like rat droppings.
Rat droppings.
They can get pretty large.
Yes, but like peppercorn looking black balls. And that is the sclerotia that Dr. Gauthier was referring to. And so, yeah, we haven't seen it here yet, but if you just see here and there spotty wilted lettuce and you know your irrigation's working and all the lettuce around it looks fine, that's probably what you're looking at. And you'll see the same thing in tomato. You'll go along your row of tomato and you'll see one wilted tomato. Typically, you can check the stem and there's some sort of wound where there is clearly mycelium growing out of it.
That's right. So infection will occur right at that crown or in those lower leaves. So it'll start at the bottom, but once the crown becomes infected, then the entire plant just collapses. And so in our spring studies, we were selecting plants early that were not showing symptoms from overhead, bringing them to the lab. And so through some of these other studies, we determined that within a week of infection, you can have complete head collapse. And that mycelia, if you leave that plant in place, that mycelia will take over the top of the plant, and all of those black sclerotia will occur on the top of the plant. And we do those types of things in research, but growers should never let it get that far. Once a plant collapses, get it out really fast, because those sclerotia will drop and again, build up in the soil.
So would it be helpful for someone to dig around the roots of that affected lettuce? to kind of remove the surrounding, just the bit of surrounding soil. Is that helpful?
If you think sclerotia fall, so this is not a root rot, this is not a root disease. So early on, just kind of catch anything, and it will usually in the beginning be attached to those lower leaves. So if you're watching it and a good grower scouting, just to be able to remove it. But if you think there are sclerotia that fell, and if you don't have a really large area and a lot of them to clean up, it might help a little bit to scoop just that surface. But again, the key is just once a plant looks bad, whether it's sclerotinia or not, is to get that plant out. So you can't reverse disease and you can't reverse that damage. So get it out and don't take those chances, because this tunnel has been infected for a long time. And that's why we decided to do this trial, because it was already infected. We did not do this ourselves. But I know a lot of growers around the state do have sclerotinia in their tunnels. So again, don't let it get worse, and let's try to balance between being able to still plant in those tunnels and utilize the space, but also to not allow that inoculum to increase. Yes. So it's got to go. And later we'll talk about solarization and what we're doing. We're looking at solarization to help destroy that soil-borne inoculum. We are talking about the optimal temperatures for the fungus. So of course, tomatoes, we plant them early in high tunnels. So we'll plant them while the soil is still cool. It's not optimal for tomato, but remember, we're farmers, we're pushing the season, but it's that cool temperature that the fungus prefers. And that's why we see Sclerotinia infections early in the season. So that 65 degrees Fahrenheit is optimal for Sclerotinia sclerotiorum.
So yeah, if a grower planting in the field in May probably won't ever come across this issue, because it's later in the season and the temperatures are already warm enough.
And if you recall, we had squash in here during the summer. In our previous field day, we had squash in here during the summer. It was just too hot for Sclerotinia. So it was there dormant, and it's still there. It's waiting. It's waiting for those temperatures to come down. So it's seasonal. And it's all based on temperature, and then of course irrigation and a susceptible host. Sclerotinia though has a very broad host range, so it's just waiting. It's waiting for those optimal conditions.
Yep.